Good evening to those in Indonesia or Southeast Asia, and good morning to people on the East Coast. I'm Margaret Scott. I'm with the New York Southeast Asia Network and New York University. And we are delighted that Sidney Jones is joining us from Jakarta, but we just had a couple of unstable internet connections a minute ago, so bear with us if they happen again. And I just have a couple of things I want to say. One, the turnout is really tremendous, a tribute to Sidney, because everybody knows she's the most brilliant person around. And that this is a new phenomenon in the pandemic that people can join in so easily from all over the world. So those of you who are new to the New York Southeast Asia Network, please go to our website and join, and then get our newsletter, because we try to do interesting things. In fact, June 17th, we're going to take a broader look, regional look, at how COVID is in Southeast Asia. Watch our newsletter for details about that. But today, we are very, very pleased that Sidney agreed to do this. Sidney is the director of the Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflict, based in Jakarta. And many of you know, for decades, we have all relied on her to help us understand many things, including security issues and religious extremism and violent extremism. Today, we are going to be focusing on COVID and on 4 very interesting reports that IPAC, and IPAC is one of the sponsors of today's event, as is NYU Wagner. She and her team have worked on 4 very, very interesting reports. And so I thought Sidney agreed to kind of give us an overview of how she sees how COVID is having an impact on security issues in Indonesia. And then we're going to go from there. And then we're going to have time for Q&A. And one last thing, there is on the bottom of your bar, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, there's a Q&A. Please submit your questions in the Q&A room to write them out, and then we will get to them later. And I hope we get to all of them. Thanks. And thanks, Sidney. Here you go.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Very happy to be here. Thanks, Margaret, and all the friends at NYU. I hope that the internet connection holds up. So I'm going to ask Margaret to wave if you can't hear properly. I want to start, though, by saying that people in New York in particular could be forgiven for thinking there were a lot of parallels with what was going on in Indonesia, because we had a central government that was really slow about acknowledging that the virus existed. We had a kind of battle with the governor, who was urging stricter measures and more reaction faster. And this had clear political implications. We had really low rates of testing, as in the US, so nobody was quite sure whether any of the data was reliable. We had overstressed hospitals, and also people beginning to use the issue of burials and overworked cemetery personnel as a kind of new metric on how the virus was progressing. And now there's huge pressure, as there is in New York, to reopen, with the president leading this argument that economics should trump medical concerns, and the governor basically saying in your dreams and urging that the restrictions continue. So there are a lot of parallels between New York and Indonesia, except that the big difference is that even with clear undercounting of the virus, Indonesia is in a lot better shape than New York was. And right now, as of today, we have about 25,000 cases. And again, even accounting for low and unreliable data, it's still nothing compared to what the US was facing, let alone New York itself. And there have been about 1,500 recorded deaths, with, again, a lot of uncertainty about the true figures, but still nothing close to what New York went through. So that's the overall picture. In terms of the security questions, Indonesia's in somewhat better shape than we thought it was going to be in. So number one, on the extremist side, we thought that there would be terrorist groups that would take advantage of the virus to wage attacks on the grounds that the enemy was weak. By and large, with one exception, a small exception, that hasn't happened. We thought there was going to be a greater reaction against the Chinese because of a long history of ethnic Chinese discrimination in Indonesia, which mostly ended after 1998 and the fall of Suharto, but which has periodically risen, particularly on the part of hardline Islamists. And we thought that the reaction to the virus in terms of anti-Chinese sentiment would be worse than it has proved to be. And we thought that there would be greater stigmatization of some of the super spreaders, which were largely religious in nature. And for a variety of reasons, largely having to do with the nature of the religious organizations involved, the reaction has been manageable. There has been some stigmatization, but it's been manageable. So that, for example, one of the organizations, which is the same organization, Jamaat Tabligh, or Tabligh-e-Jamaat, which ended up being the super spreader in Malaysia and the super spreader in India, has not gotten the vilification because of the very different circumstances between India, where Islamophobia is quite high, and Indonesia, which is a Muslim majority country. So that for all of those reasons, the security implications have been, as I say, manageable, even if there have been some concerns along the way.
One thing that it seems clear to me that in many places, the COVID episode has brought to the surface or accelerated already existing tensions and cleavages. In some places, it may actually be a turning point, a historical turning point. Other places, it's just going to accelerate trends that already existed. How would you say on issues of the national versus decentralized, those cleavages, the sort of sense of disgust with the central government and politicians in general versus local initiatives, and religious cleavages, how has the things shaped so far? Do you think this is a turning point event or just accelerating or exacerbating current trends?
No question, but that COVID has exacerbated existing lines of cleavage. And so we've seen, for example, we had political tensions between the president, Jokowi, and the governor of Jakarta, Anies Baswedan, partly because all of the hardline Islamists that backed Jokowi's rival Prabowo in the 2019 elections are putting all of their cards with Anies for the presidential elections in 2024. So as the battle over COVID broke out, there were implications for presidential politics and also for a Jokowi, anti-Jokowi cleavage that involves some of the hardline politics. In Papua, it was particularly interesting because the COVID virus ended up exacerbating distrust, which is very deep already, between the central government, which looked at the governor as someone with pro-independent sympathies, and the Papuan government, which saw the government in Jakarta as ignoring its needs and wanting to swamp Papua and indigenous Papuans with migrants from outside Indonesia. So COVID was seen as a disease carried by migrants. And when Papua wanted to have a lockdown, it was seen in Jakarta as an effort to keep migrants out. So in that way, a lot of the underlying tensions in Papua were again brought to the surface. On the Chinese side, it was particularly interesting because the areas where anti-Chinese sentiment did become a problem are areas where there was already resentment against Chinese workers who had been brought to Indonesia to work on Belt and Road initiatives or on mining projects, taking jobs in the view of local workers from locals, and in some cases paying them wages which locals said were higher than they would receive for similar jobs. So where you already had protests against Chinese workers, then you had anti-Chinese sentiment coming in from the virus.
In the national level, the Anis and the Islamists, have they invoked anti-Chinese rhetoric any more or less than before in this, with dealing with COVID?
Not really. There's been some, but it's one of the issues where you would have thought there would have been more, particularly because during the election campaign in 2019, Jokowi was accused of relying too heavily on China and so on. Now, this is an issue which may have legs after the economic impact really hits.
Right.
That right now, people are focused on, is Indonesia going to open up or not? But when we're dealing not so much with the virus, but with the economic impact it leaves behind, then the issue of the haves and the have-nots and some of the class issues and issues of inequality are going to come to the surface.
And probably dominate all political discourse for quite a while.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So as we've watched how Indonesia has tried to respond, Indonesia's decentralization has become extremely interesting to look at what it means 20 years on with decentralization. And not only does it have, you pointed out that existing tensions have been exacerbated, but the ways that they play out are very much dependent on how decentralization is playing out. So I would love to go through just an overall view that you've told me that you find it interesting that many local officials are just disregarding whatever is said from the national government. In other places, there's a great deal of effect on what the national government is doing. So first, I would love you just to tell us about how decentralization is playing out, and then I'd love to concentrate a little bit more on Papua after that.
Yeah, well, on the decentralization side, I think it's been clear that not only the central government was ill prepared for this, but once it tried to put a policy in place, it seemed to be completely dysfunctional, both in terms of the personnel that were put in charge of the COVID response, as well as the fact that there wasn't any clear picture of actually what was going on in the regions. So for better or worse, the responsibility fell to local governments to assess the situation and then deal with it. So that, for example, there's a doctor in Jakarta who was saying, even now in May, some of the medical workers had not been given instructions about procedures to follow in dealing with COVID patients. There hasn't been a public information campaign for the centers. So local officials have to make do. And in some cases, local officials have risen to the occasion admirably. One of the superstars that comes to mind is Ganjar Pranowo in Central Java, who's been very good, very clear, both in getting information out and enforcing the measures that have been announced by local government. In West Java, Ridwan Kamil has also been very effective. I think people would give high marks to Anis for this, even though people are well aware that all of the things he's doing enhances his status as a candidate for 2024. But if you are concerned about the welfare of the population and somebody's doing a reasonably good job, then who cares about the political interests involved? There have also been some very good people further afield outside the region. One of my colleagues has been working on the provincial response in Bali and in West Sumatra. And it's very interesting, the difference there, because in Bali, where anti-migrant sentiment is also quite high, the government has relied on traditional temple guards called pecalang to enforce restrictions against movement and travel and so on as a way of protecting local culture, as Bali is desperate to get people back into the tourism field, especially Chinese, who were one of the biggest sources of revenue for Bali. Whereas in West Sumatra, you don't have the same reliance on traditional structures, and you have more resistance on the part of the local population, which wants desperately West Sumatra.
In Papua always gets the worst of everything. The dispensation of the democratization period has not really hit Papua very well. But now there's also so many tensions in Papua, the anti-Malay immigration, but also within Papuans about the independence movement. Tell us about this most recent, the Freeport violence and the Highlands attack on members of the task force. What does that signify? And what will be the ramifications in terms of military and police reaction?
I think you have to go back in looking at Papua to 2019, where, well, actually, you have to go back to December 2018, where we had an attack by OPM forces on a group of construction workers that they accused of being military, who in fact, had relations with the military, but were civilian. And it resulted in, I think, 19 people being killed, a huge massacre, and a retaliation by military forces, which left thousands displaced. And a lot of the initial impetus for enhanced OPM activity was coming from some of the groups who had been involved in that complex of events. And then in 2019, we had a separate set of incidents where we had in August and September 2019, reactions to racist comments made to Papuan students in Surabaya and in East Java, which led to reactions across Papua, some spontaneous, but much of them planned, in a way that led to violence against migrants in a big way. And one incident in particular in Wamena, which led to arson attacks, which left more than 30 people dead, 8 of them Papuan by gunfire, and the rest migrants killed by being burned in their homes or shops. And again, the reactions to that have colored what we see happening today as a result, one, of the tensions between migrants and indigenous Papuans, that violence and the tensions that resulted from the violence last year are still on everybody's mind. Likewise, the violence in the Central Highlands that involved the attack on the construction workers and the retaliation has underscored not only the fact that despite everything that Jakarta has done in Papua in terms of economic development and infrastructure construction, it hasn't made a whit of difference in terms of the strength of pro-independence forces and the strength of the armed groups who are still getting money from various sources to purchase arms. One of the things we think is happening is that they have an increased capacity to impose revolutionary tax on some of the mining and agribusiness companies and so on. So what we've seen taking place in the Timika area is an assertion of power and strength on the part of some of these Central Highland groups who have always seen Freeport as the holy grail of attacks. Anything you can do to hit at Freeport will be symbolically important in the broader movement as a whole. And there's unfortunately nothing that Freeport can do in terms of assistance to the area or development or whatever that's going to assuage that particular sentiment.
Right. So things are not going to get any better in Papua, but worse after this, the pandemic is dealt with, it seems. What's so interesting is that—
Well, I think—
Go on. Go on.
No, go ahead.
No,
I think that it's true that in the overall scope of things, COVID is in a way a minor factor, but what we've seen is how it's brought out how many different lines of conflict and fault lines there are in Papua, inter-village, inter-ethnic, lots of intra-Papuan conflicts, as well as between the state and Papua.
Right. One theme that I find very fascinating, I never would think I'd think of MIT, ISIS, and POSO and OPM having anything in common, but they both have taken the state and the police as the emblem of the state as the target. And I'm now wanting to move to POSO because what has happened with ISIS, which seemed to, after Santoso's death in 2015, it seemed as though they were going to be a spent force, but quite something different has come along, predating COVID. But bring us up to date on that, and then how COVID is fitting into their attempt to be reborn.
Okay, first of all, MIT is not the name of a technology institute well known in the Boston area, but it stands for Mujahideen Indonesia Timur, or the Mujahideen of Eastern Indonesia. And it's been this tiny but symbolically very important extremist group from 2012 onwards. So it emerged out of the communal conflict in POSO that erupted shortly after Suharto fell. But as an extremist group in its own self-contained way, it really came into being in 2012. And it was one of the first organizations in Indonesia to swear allegiance to al-Baghdadi and say that it was now constituting itself as the armed forces of ISIS in Indonesia. And it's never had more than a couple of dozen people. It may have had as many as 45 at its height. And it was the only group that ever claimed to control territory, which is critically important for making presumptions about the jihad in Indonesia. That was why Marawi was so important in the southern Philippines. POSO, even though it was only a couple of jungle camps, controlled territory in a way that no other extremist or pro-ISIS group could claim to do. So it was very important, as I say, symbolically. And it seemed to have dwindled to almost nothing after joint military and police operations succeeded in killing the leader in July 2016. But very importantly, it used a humanitarian disaster to regroup. And this is one thing to be aware of when looking at the potential impacts of COVID-19. The disaster in question was the tsunami and earthquake in Palu in September 2018, when there were huge numbers of volunteers coming in to help after this terrible disaster, which killed as many as 5,000 people in that area. And there were people coming up saying they were humanitarian volunteers who actually were looking for a way to get to Poso without being suspected by the police. And there were people coming up from West Java, from Banten, which is also in the western part of Java, and Ambon in the Moluccas. And so from about, I think they were down to 6 fighters and 2 guns, they got back up to 20 fighters and a couple of more guns, but in a way that they could actually wreak some havoc in the Poso area, particularly with attacks on the police. And so as COVID hit, the question was, how is MIT going to react? And it was the one group that decided to follow the exhortations of ISIS Central, which was, now is the time to strike. The enemy is weak, they're diverted to other issues, let's attack now. And they did mount some attacks, which led to a number of them being killed, and now they're back down to, I think, 14 people and 2 guns. But what was interesting is that other pro-ISIS groups in Indonesia were less concerned about using this opportunity to strike at the enemy, and they all saw COVID as divine retribution against the West for its treatment of Islam, and particularly divine retribution against China for its treatment of the Uyghurs. But they also saw it as an indication that the end of time was coming. And this was going to be the fulfillment of Islamic prophecies. Now, one of those prophecies was that as the end of time approaches, there's going to be this big, hot, black cloud called Dukhon, which is going to envelop the earth and people will die. And some of the extremists thought that, you know, since the end of the world is coming anyway, why bother to go out and wage attacks? We can get martyrdom just by staying at home. And so they didn't do anything. And in fact, the level of terrorist plotting and activity has been lower with the coming of COVID than it was in the period previously.
But you do posit that, like after the earthquake, the time after this pandemic could provide opportunities for recruitment and potential.
Oh, so this is, yeah. So this is the other thing I forgot to mention. So even though there isn't terrorist action in the form of violence, there is action in the form of fundraising, and fundraising in the name of COVID. So in the name of assisting different communities in the name of COVID. So it's not as though everybody's given up and gone home. There is an effort to direct efforts toward fundraising in the name of humanitarian efforts, as well as probably some recruitment. But interestingly, an old name, which most people have forgotten about, i.e. Jamaah Islamiyah and the group that was responsible for the Bali bombing, has come back into play, and the last few weeks have seen the arrest of about 10 people linked to JI for various activities. Now, none of it involves a plan of violence, as far as I know, but there have been efforts to purchase arms for some future initiative. No one knows what.
So we have so many things. I hope some questions will come in pursuing that. But I want to get on to the religious super spreaders. And there's one question that I'm going to just lay out there. It comes from Gibson Haynes. The stigmatization response to Tablighi Jamaat in Malaysia and Indonesia has been quite different, despite both being Muslim majority countries. What drives this difference? So I'll give that question to you as the intro into telling us more about the Indonesian version of what these mass movements, and they were canceled, but still people came and they were spreaders.
Okay, so I think it's important to understand why religious communities, and particularly conservative religious communities, are prone to becoming spreaders unless there are measures, intervening measures put in. There's first of all, a high premium placed on numbers. So both the spreaders that we've written about, one a Pentecostal group and one a Christian Pentecostal group, and one a Muslim missionary movement, are both conservative movements that place a value in order to prove what a large following that they have. But there's also a sense, particularly as the virus began to hit, that if the virus gets us, it's God's will. And because we're very devout, God will protect us. So no one, especially in the Tablighi community, took measures to try and stop some of these mass meetings, or to in any way try to put safeguards in place so that they wouldn't turn into meetings. And it was particularly dangerous in the case of the Tablighis, because it's a transnational movement. And the Tablighis, which is a missionary movement which grew up in India, and which is now very strong in both South Asia and Southeast Asia, as well as around the world. West and East Africa are also very, very strong centers of the Tablighis now. But there's a lot of intermixing that takes place, and there is an ethos, like the Mormons in some ways, of going out of your own community to preach and gather new recruits for the movement. So every Tablighi has an imperative to try and go out on what they call khuruj for a certain number of days per month or a certain number of months per year. And this going back and forth creates intermixing. So in the Malaysia case, there were people from all over the world, including Indonesia, at this one meeting in Malaysia. But the Malaysians, more than the Indonesians, realized very quickly what was going on and immediately did contact tracing of virtually every single person that had been involved in that meeting. The Indonesians at that stage were not up to doing tracing. So even after people came back from that meeting to Indonesia, which was in March, they didn't have the capacity, or in some cases the will, to follow through on the Tablighis. And then there was a meeting of a different faction of the Tablighis. So not the people that had organized either the meeting in Malaysia or the meeting in India, but a different faction organized a separate meeting in Sulawesi, which was also going to be an Asia-wide gathering, and where there was concern by this time because the implications of Malaysia and India had become clear, but there was no will in Indonesia to try and stop it, and fear on the part of local authorities that, oh, if we try to stop it, this will create even more of a problem because they could resist and then we could have trouble on our hands and so on. So there was dithering back and forth until the day before the meeting opened on March 19th. There were 8,000 people who had already swarmed in to this area of South Sulawesi outside Makassar known as Goa. And that meeting has produced the single biggest cluster of cases in Indonesia. But again, even knowing that people were there, there was still no capacity to trace the people who had been there. And so there was stigmatization of people who had been at the Goa meeting when they came back to their own hometowns. Papua had 16 people at the meeting, mostly migrants, I think all migrants, but people who were resident long time in Papua. And there was real serious danger for a while that there would be violence against those people returning. There wasn't in the end.
I'm going to please put your questions in. Oh, there's a lot of them. So I'm going to just go to some questions. This is from Helena Galenda. Hello, Helena. And she's saying, hi, Sidney.
Hi, Helena.
You mentioned Belt and Road. Would you be able to provide further reflections on attitudes in Indonesia toward China and the BRI, given existing anti-Chinese sentiment, perhaps exacerbated by China's actions in Xinjiang? As economic pain hits from COVID, do you expect Chinese investment will be seen in a different light? Thank you.
I think there's a real bifurcation in Indonesia between the top officials of the Jokowi government who believe that China is a friend, that Chinese assistance on infrastructure has been unavailable from other sources, and that therefore we should move to get investment back on track and Chinese tourism back on track as quickly as possible. I don't think there's a realization of how deep some of the sentiment against Chinese workers is, and it's more against Chinese workers than it is against ethnic Chinese for the moment, though this could change with a big downturn on the economic side. But where we've had workers come in, the government has been completely, the Indonesian government has been completely tone deaf to the ramifications. So in the middle of the pandemic, when people were already suffering, couldn't move around, a lockdown basically was taking place under a different name in parts of Sulawesi. 500 workers were brought in. The government said they hadn't come directly from China. They'd been quarantined in Thailand. They'd been given certificates of health, but it was still tone deaf to bring them in at a time like this when concern was already so high. So I don't think there will be any impact in terms of the government's commitment to go ahead with all Belt and Road Initiative projects in Indonesia. I think there will be an effort to try and increase the number of Chinese tourists as soon as it becomes possible to do so. But I think we're going to see more problems down the road, especially as the economic crisis hits.
Okay, great. This is from your old colleague, Jim Delago. Sidney, you used a very specific formulation when talking about Papua, migrants from outside of Indonesia. Who are they? Why have they increased in recent years? And how is this migrant flow stoking conflict in Papua?
Oh, sorry, I meant to say migrants from outside Papua. These are Indonesian migrants coming in from Sulawesi in particular, also some from other areas. The important distinction is that it's not the kind of transmigration program that we had during the Suharto years, where people came in under government resettlement programs where there was a very specific security component in mind. In this case, people are coming voluntarily to take advantage of economic opportunities in Papua that have increased as Papua has been carved up into a lot of different units, and as Papuan officials who've supported the carving up into new districts and new regions and so on have basically sought to give spoils to their own clans, but they need to rely on non-Papuans to fill civil service positions that there aren't enough qualified Papuans to fill. So in that sense, local officials have become an agent of bringing migrants in as well. But it's more spontaneous migration of people looking out for their own economic interests than it is security related. There's some of that, but not very much, or resettlement.
Oh, there's so many questions. I'm getting lost. Still on Papua, and then we can move on. Someone was in Papua right before COVID hit, and he was very surprised, and this was sparked by your talking about inter-Papuan tensions, that Dani people were extremely upset. I have to get back to this. At people from Tolikara, Yalmo, who they claimed had been responsible for the attacks in Yakukimo. Have you? What is your response to that? Is that an issue between the various groups, ethnic groups in Papua?
Very much so, and there's been the tensions with the Dani and other ethnic groups have been around for some time. Started out in the Freeport and the Timika area, where the Dani and the Amungme and Komoro in particular fought over access to the gold tailings from the Freeport mine, which is this multi-million-dollar business now. And there are a couple of areas where conflict among those ethnic groups has become almost an ongoing business, because the local Papuan government, the local Kabupaten government, actually pays blood payments for people killed in the course of the fighting. So if you get $30,000 for $30,000 US for a relative who's killed in the fighting, there's almost an incentive to keep it up. But there's also been intra-Papuan tensions on a range of other issues. And I think the Central Highlands is the arena where all this is playing out. One of the interesting things that happened after COVID was the villages or kampungs were under pressure to set up physical barriers to entrance to the village. But in order to set up a barrier to entering the village, you had to know where the land boundaries should be drawn, and nobody knows in Papua. And there were barriers put down that another village claimed was actually on their land, and this set off a whole new range of disputes. In the meantime, you saw pictures of these physical barriers, gates, that were supposed to keep out people, but also the virus. And yet you had all of these Papuans sitting around in close proximity to each other, smoking without masks and so on. So it wasn't clear how much good these barriers were going to do.
So I'm going to move to back to Jakarta area. There's a question from Wayne Forrest. He wants you to comment on the current lack of enforcement of the Mudik travel ban that Baswedan put in force. Is that due to his lack of control of the police, which remains a national entity? We saw Lion Air essentially give up and cancel flights. Is there a political element here or typical Indonesian lack of capacity?
I think it's lack of capacity. I don't really think there's an element there. Basically, as Lebaran approached, or as the Eid al-Fitr holiday approached, Indonesians got bolder and
Sorry, go on. Sorry, Sidney, that was a glitch. Just disregard it.
Okay, okay. So Indonesians were getting bolder and bolder about challenging restrictions that had been put in place to ensure social distancing, ban travel home for the holidays, and basically keep a semi-lockdown in place. But as the holiday approached, there were lots of people who were looking for ways to avoid the ban on travel. The police caught some. They sent a lot of cars back. I think there were 6,000 cars that were turned around and sent back, but a lot got through. Interestingly, there were also a lot of cars that were rejected after they arrived in their places of destination. So villagers didn't want to have people from Jakarta come back because Jakarta was seen, which it was, as the epicenter. So there were lots of different issues at play, but I think we've seen now a huge amount of pressure to open mosques. Initially, there was a real concerted effort with agreement on the part of the Indonesian Ulama Council and many other mass organizations that Friday prayers wouldn't be held in mosque, that people should do Friday prayers at home. And even then, we got people ignoring that ban, and there were lots of mosques around Jakarta that continued to hold Friday prayers. But by and large, there was widespread adherence to that ban. As it got closer to Lebaran, you began to see more people ignoring it. Although in Jakarta, it was still fairly quiet. But now there's an effort by Jokowi to press for an opening of shopping centers. And the Ulama Council and others are saying, well, if you're going to open the malls, there's no excuse for keeping Friday prayer activity and other kinds of religious activities banned. So I think we're going to see more and more inconsistencies in policies toward reopening, but also more and more resistance to actually obeying some of these controls, which were never fully enforced anyway. One of the other things is that people were never very clear about what kinds of penalties to impose. So unlike Malaysia, for example, where there were clear fines and sometimes heavy fines for disobeying restrictions, in Jakarta, if you were caught trying to get through a barrier, for example, somebody made you do 20 push-ups. You know, it wasn't a serious effort at enforcement.
So there's a quick add-on to that, but we have a lot more questions, so just be real quick. One person asks, Iqbal Abisaputra, wants to know whether you think that one of the reasons that there was an argument to open the economy prematurely is that there was a fear of riots.
I'm not sure that there was a fear of riots. I think there was certainly a concern that there's certainly a concern down the road about economic riots. And the police recently issued a guidebook to COVID-19, or a guidebook to implementing COVID-19 protocols. And it lays out what it sees as the biggest security threats. And all the big security threats are economic. There's a concern about hoarding. There's a concern about riots. There's a concern about price gouging. There's a concern about deepening inequality and the social costs of all of these economic impact. And everybody is looking to 1998. That's the model that people have.
Do you think that means that the TNI and the police are going to have a major role in dealing with distribution of food or making jobs? Or I
don't think it's going to be major. There was recently, just in the last week or so, an interesting piece written by Evan Laksamana and a colleague at CSIS in Jakarta, looking at arguments that COVID had led to a militarization of Indonesian assistance more generally. and that it had led to a greater reliance on the part of the Jokowi government, particularly on the TNI. And his argument was that, yes, there are a number of senior military officials who were involved in setting in various task forces of the, including the National COVID-19 Task Force. But in fact, most of the military that have been brought in at a local level as well as at a national level are reporting to civilian authorities. So it's hard to argue that the military is taking over policy making in Indonesia. I think we still need to see how all of this is going to play out in the aftermath, because we're only at the first stage of seeing how this crisis unfolds, and people need to keep that in mind. We're dealing with the medical part now, but there's a big social and economic part to come.
One person, now there's quite a few questions on terrorism. I want to get to, I'm going to give you a couple. One person asks about Densis 88's counterterrorism capability. Has it been compromised by COVID-19? Another person asks about the role of JI in humanitarian and NGO work. And I can't find the question now. If there's any evidence of that, and if I can find the question, I will read it. So if you could take those two.
Sure.
The third one, about extremist elements. Well, you've already answered that. Never mind. Go on.
So I don't think there's been any compromise of Densis capacity, Detachment 88 capacity, in terms of working to address COVID-19. By and large, it was other parts of the police that were directed to enforcing restrictions and trying to deal with distribution of economic aid. That's the other area that the police are worried about, by the way. It's fighting over the distribution of delivery of social aid and questions about the fairness of the delivery. But Detachment 88, by and large, wasn't involved in that. And they're continuing to be devoted exclusively to fighting extremism. On the issue of humanitarian aid, we haven't seen Jemaah Islamiyah as opposed to the pro-ISIS groups. And it's important to note that JI is anti-ISIS, but we haven't seen JI being involved recently in humanitarian aid inside Indonesia. They were involved in humanitarian aid for the Syrian conflict, in getting aid to Syrians fighting on the Al-Qaeda side, and sometimes to Syrian refugee camps, but not in a major way as a result of the COVID virus.
So Meredith Weiss has a question. She wants to know whether you have a sense of what regions have been dealing better with epidemiological logistics than others. Political will, something about community structure, healthcare capacity, other factors. What's at play?
Well, I could throw the question back to Meredith on Malaysia in particular, but it looks as though the countries that did best were the countries that had a combination of good medical infrastructure, but also good surveillance capacity, unfortunately. And because that surveillance capacity was deployed for contact tracing in a way that was extremely important in identifying who had the virus or who was exposed to the virus and ensuring those people were in quarantine. But that said, the country that is always recognized as the best in both the medical infrastructure as well as the surveillance capacity has been Singapore. And Singapore kind of forgot about its migrant workers. So that ended up being a super spreader in a way. Migrant dorms ended up as a super spreader because they just hadn't been given the attention that they should have been early on.
Here's a changing subjects. This is from Erlen Irwan. Can you share your thoughts regarding the use of social media by Indonesians that have had an impact on the spread of hateful messages as well as pro-Pancasila?
Yeah, the social media issue is really interesting and really tough. The various groups in Indonesia have used social media to bring out their views on the crisis. They've used social media for hate speech, but they've also used social media for volunteerism and to gather lots of assistance by civil society volunteers when the government was not able to do so, especially in terms of, for example, getting protective gear to hospitals. And the reaction from the government has been to be so afraid of hate speech, not just directed against groups being seen as spreaders, for example, or as Chinese, but people in real, given rise to real concerns about freedom of expression, that the people who are getting arrested in Indonesia and in other places, but Indonesia is one example, are people who've used social media to express criticism of government policies, who then have found themselves accused of insulting or defaming the government in a way that really does have serious ramifications.
Good. Then one last, again on China. Early in the crisis, there was a significant frustration against China, but especially about the WHO and how the virus started. Now there's been a significant publicity about China's face mask diplomacy. This is from Amory Murphy. Can you please comment on how COVID might impact Indonesian views of China?
Well, again, I don't think there's going to be much change either at the top or at the grassroots. I think the kind of attitudes toward China are well entrenched. I think the people who are pro-China in the Jokowi government, and there are a lot of them, are looking to China for assistance now in supplying goods and services to address the virus. However, there was recently, as I'm sure you know, a big investigative story in Tempo looking at how the testing kits that were supplied by China were deeply faulty. And this was already known in studies in Europe, looking at about a 30% accuracy rate in some of the testing kits provided. But it was even more of a focus in Indonesia when the Indonesians, when they purchased these kits, thought they were purchasing Dutch products because they were they were listed as being made in the Netherlands, and then they turned out to be made under Chinese license. So there's a lot of disgruntlement in kind of the population at large, but I don't think it's changed the generally positive approach that Jokowi, Luhut Panjaitan, others in the top ranks of government have toward China as a friend and supporter.
So we're running out of time, but I have one last question, which is an appropriate way to end it. And Sidney, thank you. You've been fantastic. This is from Tigu Sasongo. What is exactly the new normal? This jargon that is floating around.
Okay, so Jokowi is using the phrase new normal to mean we will open up, but we will still obey social distancing regulations. So the malls will be open, but you have to wear masks. or the mosques will be open, but you have to be 6 feet apart, or issues. So the new normal is we'll be open for business, the economy will run again, but we will recognize that the virus is not over. But there's already a battle going on with the governor of Jakarta, who says we are not going to open up on June 4th, or at least he's saying we are not going to open up on June 4th, which is when the new normal is supposed to come into being, unless science tells us that it's okay to do so. Now, science may tell us that it's okay to do so, and Anis may go along with opening up after June 4th, but it's a very tense issue at the moment. So what the new normal is, nobody's quite sure how it will actually end up being enforced.
Great. On that note, we'll have to get you back when there's more that has happened to see what we think of it all.
Okay.
We're all virtually clapping from all over the world to thank you for coming. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody. Really good to see you all, or know you're all there.